Hello, doing a sound check. Want to make sure everybody can hear. So tonight we're going to talk about the how the Knights of Malta, what is it, and how it dovetails into Operation Gladio. And it's actually kind of interesting when you start getting into these issues, how it actually does dovetail into it. Things that you would assume had nothing to do with Operation Gladio, and the Knights of Malta is a good example of that. So, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about the 30,000 foot look. So, I had an interesting conversation today with one of the people that we banter back and forth with on True Social a lot. And we were talking about what's going on and how it's frustrating to watch the situation in Israel, the situation in Ukraine. And one of the observations that I've made, and it kind of dovetails into what we talked about a little bit about yesterday. So it's clear that there's a psyop going on. We talk about it all the time. And one of the most interesting articles I've ever read had to do with the Laurel Canyon music arena in the 60s and 70s. I posted about it quite a bit, both on the page International Syndicate as well as on my personal page on True Social, and how during the 1960s you had all of these very educated young kids, 18 to 22, on college campuses, middle class, well dressed, very articulate, talking about how they didn't want to go die in a foreign country, Vietnam. And they became very well organized. There was a lot of effort put into their line of thinking and the points that they wanted to make. And it frightened the people in Washington to no end that their war making agenda could be successfully, the potential that it could be successfully opposed. And these young people could jeopardize their income flows. So their plan was to infiltrate this group of people and to marginalize them. So what they did, they didn't necessarily infiltrate a group. They created their own entity called hippies. They dressed them crazy. They acted crazy. And alongside the Hippie Production Act, they created a never before seen before music industry in Los Angeles. The only music industry we had in the United States at the time was in New York. And so they went in there with the mafia and created nightclubs for these bands. As it turns out, all of them either had intel parents or military parents, and put them all out there, gave them tons of money, introduced drugs, and created a counterculture to the very well organized and well articulated um, anti war movement. And so you had these people operating side by side, and to the larger public, they were one and the same thing because they were both on college campuses. And so the CIA, and this is well documented, the CIA painted the anti-war movement as a hippie movement. And the two ended up being seen simultaneously, um, as one entity by the population at large. And so that was easily then discredited as a um, a non-issue, if you will. They're just crazy, they're on drugs, and they were able to silence a very vocal, very successful, um, anti-war movement by doing that. And I think there's a lot of similarities going on right now. So if you look at just take all of the religious aspects away, if none of this had to do with a religion at all, not Muslim and not Jewish, just erase that. You could look at the original landscape where Israel currently sits on every map in the 1800s was labeled as Palestine. You could also make the argument that bringing in massive amounts of people into that location and artificially drawn boundaries and cramming them all in there, and whether it was legitimately bought property, I'm not even gonna get into that. That creates friction, and there is a legitimate argument to be made because we're making it right now here. This is our country. This is our land. There are people that are being piped in by the millions. And what are we doing? We're saying no. How is that any different than the Palestinian issue? Because as we've discussed on here, Palestinians were, there was Jewish Palestinians, there were Muslim Palestinians, and there were Christian Palestinians, and there always has been. That sane argument on territory and the basic concepts is completely wiped out. Why? Because somebody funded, trained, meticulously orchestrated fanatics called terrorists. They called them hippies in California. They call them terrorists in Palestine. There, if you go and look at what happened in California with the LSD and the overdosing, there was a lot of dead bodies. In Laurel Canyon, there were a lot of dead bodies, to include the Manson murders. There was a girl that was, like, hacked up, they think it was by a pedophile doctor, a lot of dead bodies there. So, in doing that operation, they took a well-articulated argument and painted it to make it about fanatics. That's exactly what they're doing in Israel right now and in Palestine in general. So, what I want everybody to do is to recognize what they're doing and how they're doing it. Because as soon as our blood boils, we need to turn the computer off, turn our phone off, and look at what what it was that they did to manipulate us, because we are being manipulated, and we're being manipulated so that we can't think about things logically, because as soon as we think about things logically, their argument falls apart. So I that's the 30,000-foot look. So I want everybody to be aware of that. Now, our topic tonight is the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. And I looked at this whole thing. I didn't know a lot about it. So we're going to cover some of the highlights. And what's interesting to me is how it overlaps with Operation Gladio. So the article that I'm using is by an author. Um, let's see, it was written in 1986, and the author's name is Francoise, and the last name is Herbet. So This talks about it goes by a lot of different names. The Sovereign Military and Hospitalier Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta. So basically, it is a Catholic order where you can be knighted into this Catholic order, and it almost becomes you can classify it as a secret society, although you could. It's kind of like a dual status. There's a lot more made available as far as who's in it, but it is very difficult to go to one source to find out who exactly is in it. So, you will hear about people being inducted into it. So, my concern when I first looked at the list of who was in it, that's some of them that are available, I initially noticed there's a lot of military people in it. Well, you think, well, there's probably a lot of military that are Catholics. Okay. But being initiated into a the Knights of Malta is a sovereign entity that exists as if it's its own country. It can issue its own passports. It has its own military. It actually has on its page the the military, and like it has its own air force looking entity. So if you're swearing allegiance excuse me, if you're swearing allegiance to a sovereign entity when you are under oath to the United States of America, to me that's a big problem. So I'm just going to put that out there. And there's a lot of military in it. So the Sovereign Military Order of Malta had probably a larger influence in Germany during World War II than one might imagine based on the number of people that are in it, and for our purposes, probably the most noteworthy person in it is Reinhard Galen, and he was inducted into it November 17th, 1948, and that date is important because he he just went through World War II as Hitler's chief of intel. How did that not disqualify him to be in any knights of anything? But obviously, being a fascist doesn't disqualify you. Being a Nazi didn't disqualify you because there are several of them in there. So he had just been announced to be the new chief of intel in the Adenauer administration. Adenauer also was a devout Catholic, and he also was part of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, and he had been inducted by a Prince Chigi, Chai Chigi, who is Italian. And what's interesting enough, if you look that person up, that person is a descendant from the Medici line, Medici. Um, and that's thought to be one of the 12 ruling families um, in the hierarchy of the Illuminati. So I thought that was very interesting. And the Adenauer obviously is the first West German chancellor after World War II. So after the appointment of Knights of Malta William Casey, who is also a CIA director, you have another knight named James Buckley, who was affiliated with the CIA, and He also was put in charge of the US propaganda apparatus in Eastern Europe called Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So we're gonna start clicking away and adding all of these CIA people into the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. So it was also noted that one of President Reagan's phrases that he used specifically in 1982 was a crusade against the evil empire. And that takes on added weight as we start clicking away at the number of Knights of Malta who are the actual ones that waged the crusade back in the like 11th century. So its current members or knights after the frugal fashion include Lee Iacocca, John McCone, William Buckley, Alexander Haig, the guy that's the chief of French intelligence, and the president, Giscard d'Estaing, D apostrophe Estaing, who was the French president, was also a knight. Otto von Habsburg, a knight, and several of the fascist P2, which was propaganda do, Masonic order, are also military orders of Malta. And what's interesting about that, since this is a Catholic order, we've already covered this, but I'm going to say it again. It's against canon law for you to be a Masonic lodge person and be in the Catholic Church. So this article calls out a guy by the name of Franz von Papen, Papen, and it highlights this person because his actual nickname is the devil in a top hat. And he also was inducted into the Military Order of Malta. He came from an aristocratic Catholic family, was former military attaché and spy against the United States in the First World War. He later became Chancellor of Germany in 1932 with the support of the Nazis. In June of 1932, he ordered the disillusionment of the Reichstag, calling for new elections in July, in which Nazis emerged as the largest party. After a meeting with Hitler, von Papen persuaded President von Hindenburg to offer Hitler the chancellorship, which he assumed on January 1933. Von Papen became his vice chancellor, and in April 1933, von Papen was elevated to Knight's Magistral Grand Cross of the Military Order of Malta. After the murder of Austrian Chancellor Dollfuss in Vienna in July 1934, Van Papen became Hitler's ambassador to Austria. He later became the Nazi ambassador to Turkey. And then at the Nuremberg trials, he was one of the several Nazis that was acquitted and given a lifetime pension by Chancellor Adenauer. So definitely Nazis. And there's, again, you're going to see throughout this, there's a common theme here on, and if you think about it, it's actually really um, interesting using organizations like the Knights of Malta because they have meetings. They can have as many meetings as they want. Um, if most of them were held in they have like a 1 mile square of sovereign territory in Rome, but because of that, tracking who's coming and going is very difficult. So it's kind of the perfect place to hide the New World Order. So we have a guy by the name of J. Peter Grace, who is the president of W.R. Grace, a U.S. company. I'm sure y'all all heard about it. Who was a key figure in Operation Paperclip, which is the operation to bring all the Nazi scientists to the US. And he also is a Knight of Malta. And then the author goes and talks about the sovereign um, aspects, that it has extraterritorial legal status granted to an embassy of a foreign state. It has its own police force, its own diplomat. It makes its own stamps. It exchanges ambassadors with a number of countries. So it's a foreign government. So how can our military be a part of it? It just like totally blows my mind. Um, it's recognized as a sovereign. It has an official envoy to the UN. Um, what else? The Vatican and the Order of Knights of Malta believe to be the smallest sovereign state in the world. They've agreed to establish full diplomatic relationships with each other. President Reagan's ambassador to the Vatican, William Wilson, is coincidentally also a Knight of Malta. In 1984, French Foreign Minister Claude Cheysson signed a formal protocol with the Knights of Malta for various cooperative projects. The Order of St. John was given its independence by Pope Pascal II, permitted to elect its own Grand Master, and soon the order began military participation in the Crusades back in the day with Knights Templar and Teutonic Knights. The Order of St. John recruited successfully among European um, uh, aristocrats and soon controlled extensive estates throughout the continent, assimilating those previously belonging to the Knights Templar because they had been kicked out of several jurisdictions over the years. Um, and some of them were burned alive as heretics. There was a period of time where they were all kicked out of all the different countries because they were up to no good. So the article goes into a little bit of J. Peter Grace and Operation Paperclip, which is interesting to note because of the overlaps with some of these companies. So it says in a 1980 ABC TV special, Escape from Justice: Nazi War Criminals in America, which discussed Grace's role in Project Paperclip. The Otto Ambrose was a chemist and the director of the notorious IG Farben, which supplied gasoline and rubber for Hitler's war efforts. Ambrose played a supervisory role in the construction of Farben's plant in a Polish village that used slave labor. The IG Farben plant was one where 100 people each day would die from sheer exhaustion. Otto Ambrose was convicted of slavery and mass murder and sentenced only to 8 years at Nuremberg. Ambrose was a target of U.S. recruiters for paperclip. His prison sentence was commuted to only 3 years by American officials as as he helped identify people to import into the United States. J. Peter Grace, president of W.R. Grace, a major American chemical company and internal State Department, describes how J. Peter Grace helped Otto Ambrose, the Nazi, in his efforts to enter the U.S. In a memorandum to the U.S. ambassador to Germany, Grace acknowledges that Ambrose is a war criminal. He adds that he's known Ambrose for years and that he developed a deep admiration not only for his ability, but more important for his character, a Nazi war criminal. So Ambrose does consulting work for W.R. Grace and lives in Mannheim, Germany. In a recent interview, Ambrose is quoted as saying, "I'm happy to still be working as a chemist, but it's funny. Now I'm helping the Americans. Ha ha ha." Um, when a scandal broke out in West Germany over a company called Flick, Flick, paying huge sums of money to various politicians and parties, it was learned that additionally, Flick had taken improper tax waivers and used the money to pump millions of dollars into W.R. Grace, becoming a major shareholder. Frederick Karl Flick himself sits on the Grace board. Frederick Karl's father, Flick Sr., had poured money into the coffers of the Nazi Party in 1933, and the March 5th elections that he was trying to affect the elections. So basically, um, he helped get Hitler elected, which is the whole point of the conversation. And so this Flick company is very interesting because it was into coal, steel. It was the original foundation for the Daimler, the Mercedes company, and the owner, Flick Senior, is Prussian. So, it ties right into the Prussiagate stuff, which all of these things tied together, which is what's so fascinating about all of this. Um, so the article, I'm not going to bore y'all with what went on in the 1100s and the 1400s, but there was a lot of controversy over um, the establishment of the order, and it's because originally, y'all probably know this, that England was uh, recognized the Catholic religion, and that they eventually separated from the Catholic Church, and there was lots of um, to do about that. Um, so I'm going to kind of skip over because it gets very monotonous. I will just say this one part. In England, Henry VIII's assertion of an independent national policy was complicated by his marriage to Catherine, who was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, patron of the Knights of Malta, who in England were a militant bastion of papal loyalty. The intrigue of all of this is just simply amazing. So, the separation and what they went through to get out from underneath the Catholic Church in England was no short task. And it goes on to talk about how the in 1789, when Napoleon defeated the Knights and occupied the island of Malta, um, that the order had temporarily sought protection. Guess where? In Russia. Isn't that crazy? That's hilarious, actually. The American Association of the Knights of Malta, it says that in because you had to be of a royal family or of aristocrat um, heritage in order to be in this prestigious organization. So, of course, nobody in America qualified for that. Um, So, in order to co-opt America in 1927, they made an exception for us. And now they could knight us and um, loop us into all of their craziness. So you have the American Association of the Sovereign Knights Military Order of Malta was created. Founding members Patrick Cardinal Hayes, Edward Hearn, Nicholas Brady, Howard Carey, Carry, Patrick Crowley, James Farrell, James Fain, Edward Hurley, James Phelan, Morgan O'Brien, John Rathcobb, and John Ryan. So in 1941, Francis Cardinal Spillman was listed as the Grand Protector and spiritual advisor of the order, with John Raskob as treasurer. Members were John Farrell, then president of U.S. Steel, Joseph Grace of the W.R. Grace, and John Ryan. 1934, Raskob, inspired by a French fascist, and was working closely with the Morgan Bank, John Davis, had been a principal financier in the plot to organize a fascist coup in the United States, and that's about the but Smed nah, General Smedley Butler issue. In 1941, the list also included a man by the name of Joseph Larkin. Joseph Larkin was the vice president of Chase Bank. Imagine that. He was in charge of European affairs for Chase Bank, and he kept the Chase Bank open in Nazi-occupied Paris throughout World War II. He had received the Order of the Grand Cross of the Knights of Malta from Pope Pius XI in 1928, which is in between of World War I and World War II. He was an ardent supporter of General Franco, who is a fascist, and was in charge of Spain. Morgenthau first suspected him as a fascist sympathizer in October 1936. With the encouragement of Slatt, who is Hitler's banker, Larkin took on the Franco account and the Reichsbank account, though the Reichsbank was under the personal control of Hitler. So you have the guy at Chase, who is a Knight of Malta, who's basically doing Hitler's banking in America. Uh, ah, crazy. So in 1932 until 1938, Myron Charles Taylor was the chairman of U.S. Steel. In 39, he became the U.S. envoy to Pope Pius XII, a post he would maintain until 1950. And that's interesting because he was there during the setup for the money laundering for Operation Gladio. We need to check him out a little bit further. Meanwhile, according to Anthony K. Brown, who is an OSS chief for Bill Donovan, he secretly had established an intelligence connection with the Vatican as early as 1941. When he evacuated from Lisbon to New York, they founded a European Catholic anti-Comintern called Pro Deo. Throughout the war, Donovan financed Morleon Pro Deo service, and in June 1944, he went to considerable expense and time and trouble to transport Morleon from New York and establish him as the Holy See. So this is very, very important. So we're talking about the guy that's going to be set up as the new pope as we're going into Operation Gladio in the early 40s. Subsequently, Morleon became a key figure in the Vatican intel network, because of course he would, because it's Operation Gladio, working closely with Giovanni Montini. He becomes the future Paul VI. So all of these people that is part of this Knights of Malta organization go on to leadership within the Roman Catholic Church, and all of them have their fingers in the fascist rat line, Operation Gladio, and all of that stuff. So you almost start to see the overlaying of these secret societies and their fingers in all of the Operation Gladio um, puppetry that goes on that we've all learned about. So they do a little kind of a blow up of Morleon and his background because I'll just read a couple of notes. Um, Morleon, a Belgian, with the reorganization of the Vatican Intel Service and its merger with the Jesuit espionage network, the Central Intelligence Department of the Vatican is headed by Janssens, a general of the Jesuit order. His deputy is Montini, the acting Vatican Secretary of State. And remember, we know from Marcinicus that the Secretary of State runs the Vatican Bank. The acting Vatican Secretary of State and his assistants are Schmitter, an administrative director of the Central Jesuit Espionage Bureau. So now we've got the spy apparatus, and remember the not William Casey, Colby is the one that said that the Vatican has a spy network that is second to none in the world. So you kind of see the things being set up here. Um, they talk about Cardinal Spillman, who is the rector of a Jesuit college in Germany, and Catholic priest, the Catholic press secretary, because you have to have the propaganda that goes along with it. Um, and in August 1966, Morleon approaches H.L. Hunt for funding for Vatican anti-communist operations in Latin America. And what did we learn? We're the clear text of anti-communist means fascist. So they're looking the Catholic Church is looking for fascist funding in Latin America. Hunt gave an interview with the British Guardian Weekly in 1969, and he's quoted as saying, "I was approached by Paolo Cardinal Morella, who said he spoke to the Pope and asked if I could supply members of my 20,000 member Youth Freedom Speaker movement who spoke Spanish to be sent to Latin America to engage in speak making and activities. I was told the Pope was thinking in terms of $11 million a year support to the movement in Spanish speaking countries." So you see by this cutout here in these quotes um, that the Catholic Church is like basically holding hands with the fascist infiltration of South America. And that's that's crazy. Because we know through Operation Gladio that the intel apparatus had went to all of these countries and installed fascist dictators. So they are now going in with the help of the Catholic Church into these Latin American countries under the guise of anti-communist and looking for speakers and kind of you get the picture of like what's going on here in America. Um, so it makes you wonder who's behind all of it. I know we always throw out Soros's name, but it's not just him. Okay, so back to the article. The talking about the post World War II Nazi networks have shown the determining role played by the Catholic Church in the flight of war criminals. Since April 1943, there were negotiations with Pius XII and the ultra reactionary American Archbishop Francis Spillman. The Holy See became the clandestine center of the Anglo American espionage in Italy. This collaboration, in fact, had begun the previous year between Earl Brennan, a veteran of the American State Department, and Gian Battista Montini, at the time a bishop and the Undersecretary of State at the Vatican. This close cooperation was facilitated and helped by James Angleton. And that's a name that comes up all the time when you're talking about Operation Gladio. So With the American Grand Protector of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta already in contact with the Vatican, Alan Dulles begins negotiating with the Nazis in 1944 about the takeover of the Gladio units. And the article mentions a guy by the name of General Mark Clark, who was made um, a uh, Knight of Malta in July of 1944. And what's interesting about that is he disobeyed an order. He was told to go in a particular direction in Italy during our taking over of Italy during World War II. He disobeys his commander's orders and makes a beeline for Rome and never disciplined. Um, but that goes to the whole point that I was thinking when I started reading this article is how when I first saw that sign, and this just bears it out. So that he, um, as a Roman Catholic, was more concerned about securing the Rome than he was following the orders that he was given in the military operation as it had been planned. So you see right there the tug of war between who are you going to be the most loyal to? Your commanding officer in the military, if you are a military and you happen to be a member of this organization, or the Pope. Because right now you can see the strange disconnect where the Pope is saying things that Vigano, the priest, is saying absolutely is not part of the Catholicism that most people were raised with. And when you have those conflicts between what is fine in the Catholic Church and not fine in the military, who are these people going to follow? It becomes a huge, big issue. So we've got on 25 April 1945, 3 days before the German forces capitulate, Admiral Ellery Stone, the U.S. proconsul in occupied Italy, instructs James Angleton to rescue Prince Valerio Borghese, and he's the Black Prince. That's part. He's in the Masons. He's in P2, and he was one of the ones that started all of the stay behind units, Operation Gladio in Italy. So you have a military officer um, telling James Angleton to rescue the prince from the possibility of being arrested because a resistance committee had already sentenced him to death for war crimes. So they're not doing what should be done, they're doing what they want to do. Stone, the admiral, is a close friend of the Borghese family. Borghese was to be heard from again on the 29th anniversary of the Japanese attack. So Truman's Vatican envoy, Myron Taylor, received his military um, order, knighthood, in 1945. Also, Admiral Stone, the guy who rescues the Black Prince, is inducted into one of the facets of the military order because they have a whole bunch of like subcategories with very long names. December 1946, James Angleton received one of the particular orders the same day as George Raymond Roca. Roca went on to become Angleton's deputy chief of counter intel divisions at the CIA, and he was the liaison to the Warren Commission that investigated JFK's assassination for the CIA. So they're all a mess. They're all apparently, we think about the Masons, but this military order of Malta is just as um, insidious as it relates to Operation Gladio as the rest of them. So In February 1948, in anticipation of the upcoming election scheduled for April 18th, the Vatican created an organization called Civic Committees under the leadership of Luigi Gaeta, a 45-year-old doctor from Turin who was the leader of an organization called Catholic Action. Gaeta became a knight, and Gaeta is part of Operation Gladio too. We learned about him, um, and some of the terror events that was pulled off around that election time. So, excuse me, you see the overlap there. Um, then the author does a deep dive. They did kind of these cutouts sections to do like a little more in depth on particular people that are in this article, and one of them was James Angleton and Roger Pearson. And I'm only going to go into this as it relates to Roger Pearson because we already know who James Angleton is, um, and he was a big player in Operation Gladio as well. So both James Angleton and George Roca were forced into retirement in December 1974 because of Seymour Hersh's revelations that Angleton's division had been illegally domestically spying, and we learned about that in the article we were reading about the family jewels. Um, so by the winter of 1977, Angleton became one of two associate editors at a place called the Journal of International Relations under a guy by the name of Roger Pearson. The associate editor was General Robert Richardson III. The publisher was John Fisher, the president, who was also the president of the American Security Council. So Pearson, the editor, is perhaps the most important neo Nazi contact and racist propaganda in the US today, and had been a former editor of Western Destiny. So the author says that General Robert C. Richardson III, who delivered a brilliant speech on the theme of the USA and Russia nuclear balance, there was also a Dr. Roger Pearson, the guy that this article's about, the editor. And Pearson was removed as the head of the US branch of the World Anti-Communist League, which translated means World Fascist League, after 1978 conference in Washington, D.C., because of his ties to the neo-Nazi international organization were too extreme even for this newspaper that they all write for called the North American Regional um, ALCL. So you have the World, excuse me, WACL, the World Anti-Communist League, which is basically translated into saying the World Fascist League. But Pearson was even too radical to be a part of that. So he must have been really radical because of his ties to the neo Nazis, which then included, so these guys, all of the people that are part of this World Anti Communist League, are on record saying that they agree with death squads, Nazis are fine, and Nazi collaborators are fine. So this guy was too extreme to even be in that group. Pearson's mentor, a guy by the name of Robert Gayre, announced that Pearson would take over publication of a magazine called Mankind Quarterly. And Robert Gay, Gayre, Gayre, is also a sovereign knight of Malta. So Pearson continues to publish in DC in several different journals to include Mankind Quarterly, the Journal of Social, Political, Economic Studies, the Journal of Indo European Studies, and he remained on the board as a trustee of the American Foreign Policy Institute. That's just crazy. Um, oh, and then I have to say this. Um, the executive director of the American Foreign Policy Institute, of which Pearson was a member, is John Fisher. He's on this institute board with General Lyman Lemetsker, who is, we know, the guy that come up with Operation Northwood that wanted to kill all of us, so they could go take Cuba, um, and General Daniel O. Graham, more generals. And Angleton ended up working as the chairman of the Security and Intelligence Fund, whose president is former Ambassador Eldridge Durbrow, also on the American Foreign Policy Institute. You know, they just play musical chairs up there. So that's just crazy. All right. So on we go. We've got, going back to the actual article, they were talking about what was going on at the time in um, staging parades and let's see, uh, uh, for the fascist gangs being attacked in Rome, and this uh, back at the election time. And it talks about the State Department documenting Angleton as feeling quite strongly that Gaeta can be effectively used further in our interests in Italy. And they're setting up all of these organizations. One was called the Civics Committees to receive CIA funding, and the Pope is working with the CIA and all of this additional funding to sway the elections. So one of those reported to have been involved in the interference in the April 18th election was Baron Perilli. Perilli, son of an Italian admiral, who had been reportedly working for an American firm called Calvinator before the war, was a fascist and had extensive industrial interest in Italy. He was made a knight on December 1942, and by early 1945 had contacts throughout all of the German apparatus, the Nazi apparatus. He became a representative of the SS General Karl Wolff to Allen Dulles. And remember, Wolff is the guy that was over Operation Gladio's werewolf units before they were transformed into Operation Gladio. So he was working with Allen Dulles and General Lemetsker during the period that the latter two were involved in private negotiations to recruit top Nazis before the end of the war. It had been rumored that Pirelli also had concocted a plan to transport ex Nazis from Germany to Paraguay. And what's interesting about that is Paraguay is one of the places that we learned that um, is a hotbed for the what's going to be the new war on drugs. So you had Uruguay, Paraguay, and Argentina when Nixon comes in and he starts dismantling the Corsican mafia drug trade to pay for Operation Gladio. Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina are kind of like the um, Southern Golden Triangle, if you will, for transmitting all the drugs. And so you have a guy here, one of the knights, who's setting up the Nazi rat lines going into Paraguay. It just is amazing how these articles, when you know what the background is of Operation Gladio, these things just lay comfortably right on top of it and fills in cracks as or holes that we may have had. Um, you have Reinhard Galen's brother had already been in Rome when they're trying to set all this stuff up in 1948, serving as the secretary to Thune Hohenstein. Conveniently for Reinhard, who had been negotiating with the US for the preservation of his Nazi colleagues, Thune Hohenstein was chairman of one of the Knights of Malta's grand magisterial charities called the Institute for Associated Immigrations. Well, isn't that convenient? We got a lot of people we're gonna be immigrating around. So, hey, let's call our bud on the immigration committee for the Knights of Malta. And, we've got the, Knights of Malta as a sovereign state that can issue its own passports, and so can the Vatican. I mean, send them all through. What a great setup. They even dress them up like, um, priests in some cases. So, in 1950, the American Committee for Liberation from Bolshevism was created, because of course it was. The trustees included J. Peter Grace from before, of W.R. Grace, Charles Edison, William Henry Chamberlain, and get this, y'all are gonna love this. All right, H. J. Hines II. I'm gonna go ahead and read these. I'm coming back to Hines in a second. Isaac Don Levine, Eugene Lyons, and this thing that they're calling the American Committee ends up being called the Committee, which then becomes known as Radio Liberty, which is a CIA front. Okay, so all of these people that I just read off are going to be working on the committee, which is a CIA front company. Okay, so I want you to keep that in mind. Now I'm going to tell you H.J. Hines II. When you look him up. He goes by Jack. His name his son is named John Hines. John Hines is the senator that gets killed in a plane crash that is very fishy. His wife remarries John Kerry. That's the Hines I'm talking about here. But you know what's even more interesting than that? Do you know who John Hines' second cousin is? Or excuse me, who H.J. Hines the second's second cousin is? Fred Trump. President Trump's grandfather is H.J. Hines the second's second cousin. Is that some crap? Mind blown. Okay, on we go. In 1953, Catholic fanatic that's not my words. This is the author's words. Claire Booth Luce, Luce, became the U.S. ambassador to Rome. And I was telling Julie earlier that this is something that we probably need to do in these countries that we know that a lot of Gladio happened. We need to go back and look at who was the CIA station chiefs during the time and who were the ambassadors, because the ambassadors are involved in all of this. So Claire Booth Lutz in 1953, at the height of them setting up Gladio units all over Italy and the money laundering drugs through the Vatican Bank, you have Claire Booth Luce, Luce, as the U.S. ambassador to Rome. She was also inducted in 1956, 3 years later, into the Knights of Malta as a Dame of Malta. In 1954, with the backing of Cardinal Spellman, the General Edward Lansdale, the Catholic, um, so General Edward Lansdale, if you remember, is the guy that was the liaison in South Vietnamese to the Catholic um, uh, president of South Vietnamese, guy that we set up that we eventually killed. Um, and let's see, lost my train of thought. Commenting at an event in Hungary in 1956, two Soviet journalists writes this: "We spoke with a count that I'm not going to even try to pronounce, who bears a great responsibility for the crimes of the fascists had committed in Europe, but he was not tried as a war criminal after 1945. After Zenti's return to Budapest during the counter-revolutionary events, this person, Caroli, took advantage of his being an old friend of the cardinal's to meet Menzenti several times, during which he received instructions for the organization, and that organization was set up by the former fascist Ministry of Industry." And they go on to talk about that the liaison man and the Duke of Liechtenstein, who came officially to Budapest during the October events in the capacity as a representative of the International Red Cross, but actually as a representative of the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which had helped a- actively in promoting the counter-revolutionary. So what this that's a long way of saying basically what they're saying in Hungary, because Hungary was a former Axis occupied country and Soviet took it over, that they had stay behind units there. And he's talking specifically about them creating chaos and terror in Hungary and doing so as a representative of the Knights of Malta. By November 1961, Kennedy appointed John McCone as CIA director when it became clear that Diem from Vietnam could no longer stay in power. McCone oversaw the assassination of Diem. McCone is listed as a member of the Knights of Malta as well. Of course, he is. With McCone heading the CIA and Angleton as the chief of counter intel, another Knight of Malta of fascist fame, Italian General Giovanni Di Lorenzo, who had been the chief of the secret police, now known as SIFAR, which we came across multiple times in Gladio, and in 1962, head of the Carabinieri, again, we came across them, organized an attempted fascist coup in July 14th, 1964, called the Plan Solo. We covered that already. Um, and 6.5 years later, on the night of December 7th, 1970, Angleton's Prince Borghese, the Black Prince, gave the order for Stefano del Chiani, Chiaie, to proceed with seizure of the Interior Ministry of Rome, along with 50 fellow Nazis. The plot to trigger a fascist coup was called off at the last minute, and Borghese and his Nazi protege, Della Chiesi, fled to Spain, where former SS commando Squarzeni, who we talked about last night, among others, was waiting for him. So, again, all Knights of Malta involved here, all Gladio operations. They literally lay over top of each other. So the next area is where they go over the P2, the Masonic Lodge that's in Italy. Freemasonry generally purports to be hostile to Catholicism. It's actually against canon law. The Vatican has at various times forbidden Catholics to join Masonic organizations. 1969, an exclusive meeting was held in Rome. The ambassador of the Order of Malta to Uruguay, keep in mind that's a drug destination for Nazis, who has been called, quote unquote, the brains behind the fascist P2 Masonic Lodge, which had been established in the mid 60s. The meeting included not only, Jolly, which is the Grand Poobah Mason guy of the Masonic P2 Lodge, but Roberta Calvi, remember him? He's part of Operation Gladio. He's the guy that got hung off the bridge in Britain with the orange rope with rocks in his pocket, and Michele, Sedona, that remember about him? He's the guy that, faked his own kidnapping, shot himself, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, he ended up poisoned and dead. Jelly had fought for Franco, who is the, fascist dictator in Spain, with Mussolini's troops during the Spanish Civil War. He is a committed fascist during World War II. He's also atheist, and at the end of the war was wanted by the partisans for collaborating with Nazis. After the war, he developed extensive interest in Latin America, where he became close friends with the Argentinian dictator Perón. He was also the Grand Master of the P2 Lodge in Italy. Calvi had fought on the Eastern Front during the war and was a decorated Nazi. Sedona had set up businesses in 1943 with the help of Genovese, who's mafia, and facilitate he was one of the ones that helped work with the American, mafia for the landing on Sicily during World War II. Sedona had received a letter of introduction to the Vatican intelligence operator Montini. So, you see again how all of this stuff just delves right in together. One of Sedona's first steps in cultivating the Vatican's money men occurred in 1950s when, through the priest, he met Prince Massimo Spada, a Vatican nobleman and a senior layman in the Vatican Bank. In 1942, Pius XII, that the bank was created in 1942 by Pope Pius XII. So you have Giovanni Montini, who had become the Cardinal Archbishop of Milan in 1954, and he eventually becomes the Pope. In 1959, he needed to raise a bunch of money to build an old folks' home, so he turned to Sedona, and they raised $2 million in a single day, and Sedona purchased a small Milan bank called Banca Privata, and that's all money laundering for, Operation Gladio. This is stuff we've all went over already. 3 years later, Montini was elected Pope Paul VI, and Sedona's Vatican connections were unbeatable. So, it's just telling you that all of these Knights of Malta, before they get into the prime stage of where we saw them in Operation Gladio as a player, this is filling in the history of some of their connections prior to when we came across them in our book reviews. And it's making the affiliation, which of course none of our books, I think maybe 1 or 2, they may have mentioned that they were a Knight of Malta, but not this elaborate overlaying of their affiliations. So it goes on to say, in '81, a high number of ranking members of the Italian Ministry of the Intelligence Organization were both Knights of Malta and members of P2. The list of dual members included General Vito, which we remember, um, and a guy by the name of Admiral Giovanni Torrisi, the head of the General Staff of the Army, and Giovanni Alavina, who was head of the Intel Services, then called SIFAR. Later, it became SISMI, SISMI. So in 1983, the Vatican was finally forced to establish an independent commission. We've already went all over that, and that's when it was headed by the former Chicago Archbishop Markinicus, who we find out that he oversees all of the money laundering and ends up in retirement in Arizona, and U.S. refuses to. He was tried in absentia, and the United States would not extradite him to Italy, our ally. Um, so the Banco Ambrosiano and uh, two of the three members selected for um, working on this commission was Herman Abbs, ABS, and Joseph Brennan. Abbs, who features in nearly every book on the Third Reich and the Nuremberg trials, was Hitler's paymaster and chairman of Deutsche Bank from 1940 to 1945. And Deutsche Bank is one of the number one money laundering banks in the world still today. He was also a member of the IG Farben board, um, and he got his IG Farben board membership back after the war. Um, In 1953, he received the Great Federal Service Cross for his services in restoring West Germany's financial power. He was decorated by Franco for his services for fascist Spain. The choice of Abs for the Vatican Commission of Inquiry was so outrageous that, at the urging of Charles Higman, the Wiesenthal Center issued a special packet of documents clearly showing Ab's involvement in the war crimes, but it didn't do anything. They left him on it. So if y'all remember, also, let me just finish this. Joseph Brennan was the chairman of the executive committee for the Immigrant Savings Bank in New York, and he's also a Knight of Malta. So you guys remember when we did that book review and we were talking about how Italy couldn't do anything because they were money laundering in it was a sovereign bank. They had no oversight, and there was all this gnashing of teeth and stuff like that. And finally, in the first book we did, Paul Williams, it talked about there being a commission and how even the commission had found all of these things that were wrong and suspected money laundering, and they didn't do anything with it. Um, and um, Come to find out that it really didn't matter at all because the people they put on that commission, according to this, are Knights of Malta, and they're all in on it. And so that's why I'm saying I think it's interesting to go delve into some of these things, and you see that we're not wasting our time in looking at these books and finding out what the real story is, because then we can find articles like this that corroborate everything independently of what we already know. So I just find that very interesting. Um, so there's a couple of other things. Part of the Knights of Malta is a like a hospital medical aspect to it. Um, and we did um, make sure that um, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. My daughter just texted me. Um, we I'm gonna take time out here and just tell you a personal story. Um, we had a Amazon box delivered, like 2 days ago, and I'm thinking we opened it up, not realizing it wasn't even addressed to us, and I'm like, "Oh, I'll go back and" it's dog food, we don't have a dog, and so I'm like, "I'll just walk it over to" all my neighbors have dogs, and I'm like, "I'll just walk it over to whichever neighbor." So I went back to the box, and I'm like, "Valrico? Valrico's like 30 miles from here. How'd that bag of dog food get here?" My daughter just texted me and said it was a $95 bag of dog food. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, because she has dogs, I told her to come pick it up because I wasn't driving it to Valrico. Um, the private humanitarian organization called AmeriCares Foundation is part of the Orders of Knights of Malta. They've channeled $14 million at this time, it was the 1980s, um, to now here's this gets very interesting. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, um, and what we find in all of these, Nicaragua's on the list, all of the workings of this is an overlay of where they're doing coups, where they're, uh, uh, toppling nationalistic, non-Western, um, governing bodies in these states, and you have the Knights of Malta through these other cutout organizations going in and funneling money into these. And under the auspices of medical care, you have to have ships, you have to have aircraft. So, how much medical care do you think's going on versus weapons trafficking versus drug trafficking? All under the auspices of medical care. So, um, we've got um, that kind of at the end of it. I want to the other names of it was more World Medical Relief and they this is just so sad. Um, it does appear that you could make the case um, that um, the Knights of Malta is not a good thing. Um, there's also I will put the link on the comments to this article, and also it lists several well-known knights, like the governor of Alaska at the time, president of Merrill Lynch, railroad guys, U.S. senators, ambassadors. Um, I just think it's another facet of something that we need to pay attention to, and I also think that in when we get to the point where we're cleaning all of this stuff up, there definitely needs to be a prohibition of allowing anybody in the military to be a Knight of Malta. Um, they have to renounce it, not be part of it, because of the dual loyalty that is now coming up as far as citizenship goes. So it's not just citizenship, it is membership in secret societies that has to be excluded from service in any office in our future government. So that gets us to the end of the article. Thanks for being here. Appreciate y'all's time. I know it's very valuable, and I am honored that you're a part of this. So thanks, and I will see you next time.